Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the MacGill Committee for inviting me this evening. It was an important debate and has attracted one of the largest audiences MacGill has ever attracted. And it's a sign of the nature of the crisis that Ireland is in, that there is such huge interest in how we resolve the crisis that we face. And if we took economics as a discipline for granted in recent years, we can no longer afford to do so. Political economy was often the description given to economics in college courses, and of course it is political economy, because the choices are both economic and political. And they're important choices, because if we make the right choices now, we will create a better future for our own children and for those who want to live and work in a sustainable Ireland in the future. And if you look at the whole question of this evening's debate, it's about the options. What are the realistic options facing us if we want to go forward as a nation, as a state, if we want to build on the economic strengths that we constructed in the decades since Whitaker, who were rightly commended by Eamon Gilmore this evening? What strengths can we build on now, and what mistakes can we correct? And I have a presentation which I hope to bring you through with your indulgence, and which I hope will set out, first of all, the question which I noticed the previous speakers devoted a lot of time to. Why are we where we are now? And again, if you look at what international commentators are saying, many of them are suggesting, as we know from the programmes beamed into us, that the Celtic Tiger model has failed, that the model is no longer sustainable in the Ireland of today. But in fact, if you look at what happened in the 1990s, we saw huge export-led growth in 1994, 95, 96, right up to the year 2000. And that was the era that saw an alignment of our living standards with those of other European countries. And that alignment was secured in that epoch. And that alignment was built on a solid foundation of export-led growth. And those exports are still there and still being made. And it was T.K. Whitaker, indeed, back in the 1950s, who torchlighted the future for us when he said that for a small economy like ourselves, we had to open ourselves to the world and build on the foundation of our exports of our goods, and in recent years, of course, of our services. Build on that so that we can have a sustainable economy to create the kind of society that everyone here has talked about this evening. And if we look then at where our problems emerged, we can see very clearly that after the turn of the millennium, we saw an over-dependence on house building. New house building as a share of our national wealth grew dramatically. If you look at the broken line there, you can see averaged out our housing demand over the entire period from 1990 to date. And then if you look at the blue line, you can see the actual supply. And in fact, and right down to 1999, you can see that line lagged substantially below the average output, the average requirement. And you can see up to 2002, a growth which would have met capacity. And then after 2002, you can see that radical growth in house supply, which again led to a radical deterioration in the same in the last 2 years. And that over-dependence on construction was something which happened, which was caused by a number of factors. And naturally and understandably, the opposition will hold the government to account for that. But I didn't see the opposition parties at the time hold the government to account for this at all. In fact, in the last general election, and this isn't a political argument, and I don't want to because the tone this evening has been very constructive. We don't need to have a political debate about this. But it is a fact that in the last general election, it was my party pointed out that you couldn't reduce stamp duties, that you couldn't transfer the accumulated wealth of the wealthy property owners at the expense of the new coping homeowners. And we stood on that platform, and the other parties wanted to abolish stamp duties then. Can you imagine what the graph would have been like had we done that? Now, I'm not saying that we as a government shouldn't take primary responsibility for what has happened, because in hindsight, and hindsight is a wonderful thing, in hindsight it is clear that the government should have taken far more steps to correct that housing bubble. But no alternative was propounded on the other side of the benches in Leinster House. Now, in relation then to the more important and fundamental question of our present problems, I'll move on to the next slide. It's very clear, if you look at that red line, that the fundamental problem we have been facing, and facing since the turn of the millennium, is a loss in competitiveness. Some of that, yes, can be accounted for by the fact that we're in a strong exchange rate area, that we joined the euro, that gave us all the stability and all that economic and monetary stability we needed, but also part of it was excessive costs. Excessive costs in labour costs, excessive costs in the cost of our public services, and excessive costs through sheltered sectors in our own economy, overcharging for goods, overcharging for services. And I'm not certain that anybody in public life, government or opposition, could have dealt with that competitiveness issue, because we all know the sheer scale of the growth we saw in Ireland from the mid-90s on. We all know the phenomenal growth rates we saw in the late 90s of 7 and 8 and 9%. And we all know that if you have growth year on year on year, as we had from the early 90s, that it's very, very difficult to prick that bubble, or very, very difficult to get the soft landing, or to persuade people that competitiveness should transcend all other considerations. We didn't succeed in that. I accept that. And I accept that point, but I would make the point that our competitiveness is fundamental. Because if you accept the thesis that we have to supply and create the Ireland of our dreams in terms of public services, in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of welfare, this all has to be paid for. And it can be only paid for through the strength of the productive economy. And the productive economy can only flourish if the productive economy is competitive in a wider world. We can't expect the rest of the world to owe us a living. We have to make our own way in the world. That's what independence means. And that's what independence has always meant. That's what independence meant in the 1920s as much as it means now. If you look at what happened and what governments did during those years from 2003 to 2007, you can see substantial benefits. I'm only taking those particular years. I could go back further, right back to the mid-90s, but just taking those more recent years, look at the benefits of what the government did. There were social welfare increases of 7 to 10% every year. There was a huge spending on education. Spending per student rose by more than 1/3 at primary and secondary levels. Spending on health increased by 80%. The numbers employed in the health sector rose by 15%. The public sector wages rose 6% every year. Capital expenditure of 31 billion took place during the boom years. We all know what was done and what is going on and still to be completed and will be completed in terms of national motorway networks. Again, income tax cuts of 3.5 billion were made, and a pension reserve fund of 21 billion was built up. I think it's very important we reflect on this, because I've had a very difficult job to do in the last year, and a lot of citizens have said to me, we got nothing from the Celtic Tiger. We have to face facts. We all got something out of the Celtic Tiger, or at least the vast majority of us got something out of the Celtic Tiger. It wasn't something for bankers and developers. It was social welfare increases. It was increased spending on all these items of public services. It was an increased living standard for many, many citizens. And that's something that is very welcome and something we all struggled for and wanted. And yes, the economy has been very badly affected, not just by domestic factors, but by the worst global recession since the Great Depression. I think that's something also we need to reflect upon. There's no point being insular in our attitudes in relation to this. There's no point saying, as George said a few moments ago, that this is uniquely the fault of either the Irish people or their government. Because even if we had a housing crisis, we could have corrected that. If there was an oversupply in the housing market, the market could have been corrected. If there was an imbalance in the public finances and we'd gone a little bit too far after 2 decades of unrivaled prosperity in terms of our public services, that could be corrected. But all this correction has to take place not in a uniquely national context, but in an international context where many other countries are experiencing the exact same problems as ourselves. Ireland is not unique, and when we study what has happened in other countries, we learn from them. We don't beat ourselves up. We don't, as Sean Lemass always said, feel sorry for ourselves all the time. We look at what we can do for ourselves when we're faced with a crisis which is not just a local crisis, but an international crisis. And look at the growth, the annual growth in our major trading partners. Look at the position in the United Kingdom, outlined in the first graph there, where you have less than 4%, over 4% decline in national wealth this year. Look at the position in the United States, where again it's approaching 2.5%. And look at the position among our partners in the euro area, where it's almost 5%. There's been a catastrophic decline in exports in Germany, not just in the motor car trade, but in the exportation of machine tools and in a vast range of manufacturers for which Germany has justly earned the reputation of being the workshop of the world. So the idea that our problems are unique is a fallacy, and the idea that there's a unique solution to them and that we can ignore our European partners or treat our European partners as a burden who are imposing a particular path on us is completely wrong. We have to decide the right path for ourselves here. This is something we have to decide for ourselves as a people. This is not something which can be imposed upon us by anyone else. This is a case where we have to take responsibility for our own problems and decide what to go about them and how to go about them. And I want to turn to that whole question of remedies, because this conference is about the options. What are the options? There is only one possible path to recovery, and there are three elements to it. One is to have sustainable public finances. The second is to regain our competitiveness and boost our employment and create real jobs in a real economy. And the third is to repair our banking system. Now, these remedies are complementary. It's not possible. This is not a la carte. I've followed with great interest the debate on board SNP, where it is suggested that it is a la carte, and I'll deal with that later. But as far as this particular menu is concerned, this is compulsory. If Ireland wants to pay its way in the world and get on as a country, if we want to create jobs, real jobs in a real economy, if we want to have proper public services, and if we want to have a banking system that functions and gives credit to businesses and to consumers and those who want to buy houses and motor cars and develop jobs, then all of these elements must be addressed. And I'm glad from listening to what Eamon Gilmore said this evening that whatever our disagreements may be, he did identify these issues as fundamental issues that have to be addressed. We might disagree about how we address them, but at least it's agreed. And there's an element of common agreement with Fine Gael as well on this. But I think it's important to remember that the remedies may be complementary, but the issues are separate. There is no point when discussing the public finances in suggesting that this has all been caused by bankers. If we had no banking problem, if we had no developer problem, we would still have a public financial problem. And I want to illustrate that to you through a graph showing how our public finances and what their trend has been since 2000 to 2009. And the red light there, or the red line rather, illustrates expenditure. The blue line illustrates revenue. And clearly from 2000 to 2007, these lines remained in alignment. There was a broad match between revenue and spending. But since then, there's been a marked deterioration. On the revenue side, there's been a deterioration because, and George Lee is right on this, there was a big decline in the discretionary taxes and the receipts that we got from stamp duty, from capital gains, and from other forms of tax. We harvested those taxes in the good times. They're not available to us now. And big amounts of them are not going to become available to us in the future, because we all know that asset values have declined, and hence capital gains tax receipts are not going to increase. And much was made this evening of the threat of further increases in taxation. I've made it very clear that I don't intend to increase taxation the burden of taxation to any great extent in the next budget. It's not open to us to do it. Our income tax levels were increased in the September budget last year and in the supplementary budget in April. That had to be done because of the scale of the decline in our income tax receipts. That had to be done because our tax base had weakened. That had to be done because, as one speaker fairly acknowledged this evening, we have the lowest income tax in the world apart from 2 countries. But there's a limit to the extent to which you can increase income tax. There's a very definite limit, because Ireland won't attract investment, won't attract jobs from other countries, won't attract any kind of economic development if we raise income tax to unsustainable levels. In relation to expenditure, we again provided many good services. We increased our expenditures, but we have increased our expenditures to a level where there is now a 20 billion gap between spending and revenue. Now, some of that gap relates to investment expenditure and capital expenditure. Some of it relates to what Eamon Gilmore was describing earlier as very important: investment in roads, investment in infrastructure, investment in science and technology in the future. And we can justify asking our children to pay interest on that borrowing. We can justify asking our children and our grandchildren to pay the interest on the cost of paying the price of building a school in our localities, of building a road. We can't justify asking our children and our grandchildren to pay for the cost of paying our own salaries as public servants, of paying the cost of welfare, of paying the cost of my salary and the professor's salary and the guard's salary and the teacher's salary and everyone else's salary. We can't justify that. We have to wake up and face that issue. And it's not an issue that can be postponed forever, because we're doing it now, and the interest payments mount up. In the end, when it comes to day-to-day expenditure, a state is like a household. It has to live within its means. And we have lived within our means for 2 decades, but we're not living within our means at present. And to address that is a fundamental issue which any Irish government has to face. This is not a discretionary or optional issue. This is an option that anyone you elect to government at present has to exercise and has to deal with. That hole between current spending and revenue, and the extent to which that gap is between current spending and revenue, has to be plugged. And when you go about plugging that, you have to look at the whole of public expenditure, and you have to look at how it's made up. 21%, very substantial amount, 21 billion rather, is accounted for by payroll costs, by the current salary costs of paying the public servants who do so much in delivering good public services. Another 20 billion is accounted for by the welfare payments that are needed to protect the vulnerable in our society. And a final 16 billion billion on the current side is made up of programmes. It's made up of the cost of the rest, apart from the basic transfer payments. And then the 7 billion is the capital, the investment projects I mentioned already. So the idea which you hear again and again in public debate, and I've heard again and again, having lived through 4 budgetary adjustments, that some expenditures are immune, that we can't look at everything. It's not sustainable. You have to look at everything. I'm not saying you have to reduce everything, but you at least have to examine everything. And that's the message of Colin McCarthy's report, that we have to look at our whole range of expenditure to see how we bring it into balance. And of course, debt service is excluded from that calculation. We don't include in that calculation the cost of furnishing and servicing a debt if we decide to ignore this problem and assume that the rest of the world will continue to believe that they owe us a living, and assume that we should keep on borrowing for all of this into the future. Last year, when I became Minister for Finance, I was appointed Minister for Finance, we saw the very dramatic deterioration last summer in the public finances, when we saw for the first time this radical drop in the tax revenues. And I immediately moved with the government to take action on this. So in July 2008, we contained expenditure by $1 billion. In the October budget, we carried expenditure containment further. Remember that expenditure was growing at 8%. We drew that back to less than 0% for all of the government departments, except health and education and social welfare. And we raised taxes in that budget. Again in February, because the position had deteriorated further, we were obliged to look for further savings of $2 billion, and included in that was the pay reduction for the public sector through the pension levy. And then in April 2009, you saw the supplementary budget with further expenditure reductions and revenue increases. All of that has added up to a 5% adjustment in our national wealth this year. Now, suppose we hadn't done that, what would have happened? Well, our borrowing requirement would have gone to over 15% of our annual wealth. There's no country in Europe at that level. There's no country in Europe at the 10.75% level, which we will be at this year. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that if we let our borrowing go to that level, our country would have been in very dire financial straits. So the government had to take this action. It was essential that this corrective action take place. And it did take place. It's not something that Europe forced upon us. It's something that we did for our own sake as a government. We knew that this would not be popular, but we knew that this was required to keep this country on the road. That's why we did it, and I make no apologies for doing it. And I mentioned patriotism in the October budget, and I saw a lot of sneering comments about that. We're going to have to face up to the fact that if we don't accept we belong to one country and we must work together as a community, and I know the vast majority of deputies agree with that, we're not going to make progress on this issue. If we're all going to say that this can't be solved other than on my watch, then we're not going to solve this problem. That's the reality we face, and that's the reality any successor of mine will face in the Department in Finance in 6 months, 12 months or 3 years. Now in relation then to our commitments overseas, we have set out a multi-year fiscal consolidation programme. We have set out a plan for the next few years. We have said we'll do an adjustment of 4 billion in 2010 and 2011. And the European Commission has endorsed these actions. We haven't just set out that plan for the benefit of the European Commission in Brussels. We've set out that plan because that's what will create confidence in Ireland overseas. That's what will allow us to borrow the money we do need to borrow to keep building roads and building schools and building piers and developing industries. And we do need to do this also so that we continue to pay our public servants and continue to pay our welfare payments, some of which have to be funded by borrowing. And we have to show that we are capable of managing our affairs and that we have a credible pathway out of the fiscal crux we're in. And that's why we've set out that programme. And it has been endorsed by the European Commission because the Commission realise how difficult this is for the government, and they're anxious to show that Europe is in full support of this and of what we're doing, as is the European Central Bank. And faced with all of this, of course, in the political debate and the political argument, we hear many arguments. We're borrowing, one of the main arguments that's made repeatedly is that we should engage in a stimulus. Well, the first point to make is that this year we're borrowing 10.75% of our annual national wealth. That's a big stimulus in itself. We're borrowing all that money to keep ourselves going. That's the biggest possible stimulus. As I said already, we're not in a position to go very far beyond that. There's a very definite limit to how much we can borrow. And additional borrowing will push up the costs of servicing our debt. And stimulus leaks out of a small open economy through higher imports. It's not as if a stimulus and the injection of more cash is suddenly going to create loads of more jobs. Were that the case, I'd have recourse to it immediately. In fact, of course, the stimulus might well lead to an increased purchase of imported goods and an increased recourse to foreign holidays and a further deterioration in the state's overall position. The public finances are important. They're a distinct part of the problem. They're entirely distinct from the banking problems, not the only problem we face. I outlined earlier the difficulties we have in relation to competitiveness. We have to boost employment. We have to create jobs. I think we all agree on that. They have to be real jobs. And if you look at the position in Ireland in recent years, we've been very successful in building up real jobs through the export-driven industries. We've been very successful in creating service jobs, jobs in industry, jobs in agriculture. We've also created jobs in the public services, and that's right, and it should be the case. But our pay rates are way above all of the European averages. When I was appointed Minister for Finance, we had the highest unit labour costs of any country in the Eurozone, way out of line with every other country in the Eurozone. In the last year, we've seen rapid adjustments in our unit labour costs. If you look at this is the projection the European Commission has made for this year in terms of our unit labour costs. If you look at the green bar, that illustrates Ireland, where you've seen an average of a 4% reduction in unit labour costs. If you look at the red bar, that shows the EU average increase, which is a 3% increase. So there's been a 7% improvement in our unit labour competitiveness in the last year. And that's a tremendous tribute to the Irish workers, to Irish public servants, and to those in the private sector who've made these huge adjustments. We all know what the adjustments in the private sector have involved. They've involved, in some cases, people taking huge wage cuts to avoid unemployment, in some cases as high as 30 and 40%. We also know that within the private sector, there are those who've taken more modest decreases, or those who've taken pay freezes and given up bonuses and overtime and the like, which is a real reduction. And then we also know that in the private sector, there are still some sheltered sectors that have paid pay increases. So there's a very wide divergence in the private sector pay rates between +3 and -30 or 40. We know in the public sector, of course, what the government decided upon, and the pension levy averages out at a -6.8% reduction in all public salaries. Clearly it's higher for those at the top and lower for those at the bottom. That's how you regain competitiveness in unit labour cost terms. It's something we have to do. It's something we're doing. It's something, if you look at this whole graph, that no other European country are doing. And every other European country are rewarding themselves more despite their difficulties. I'm not sure that that will persist into next year, because the scale of the deterioration in some of the other European countries is growing. Ireland was the first into the recession, and it's certainly my ambition to get Ireland out of this recession first. And there aren't easy solutions, George, and you can't postpone the pain. It has to be done now, because that's how we'll create jobs for the future, not through chasing economic delusions, but by looking at realities and making an adjustment after 2 decades of unrivaled prosperity. I want to deal with the banking system. It's a very difficult subject because it's prone to massive misrepresentation. First of all, there is no doubt that the banks were utterly delinquent in borrowing vast sums overseas. If the state finances were well looked after, in the sense that we have a very low state debt, and our starting position as a state on the debt front was very low, our starting position on the bank debt front is very high. The banks borrowed abroad to fund the construction cycle and to fund a great deal of borrowing in the Irish economy. And the banks became increasingly stressed as the whole world bank system became stressed in the last year. And governments throughout the world have not had to face a banking crisis on this scale since 1929. And most of us heard about what happened in 1929 from our parents and our grandparents. The stock exchange collapsed in New York in the famous great crash of the autumn of 1929. In those days we didn't have the type of technology we have now, and it took a long time for the signals of that stock crash to transmit themselves through the different economic markets. In the United States, many of the banks had loaned money to the stock exchange speculators, much as they loaned money in Ireland to the building speculators. And the stock exchange speculators, of course, went bust very quickly. We all recall the famous stories about individuals throwing themselves out the windows of great buildings. But the United States banking system tottered on until early 1930. And beginning in early 1930, depositors began to form queues at the banks to demand their money back, and the banking system went into collapse. As the banking system went into collapse, credit didn't just dry up in the economy, it collapsed completely. And the United States soon found itself by 1933 with 33% unemployment. So when you let banks collapse, as was advocated by one speaker this evening, it's not a cost-free decision. If you decide to let a bank go to the wall, there are very big consequences. And President Obama has spoken very well about this in recent years and pointed out that there is the natural and understandable wish on everyone's part to let those who loan the money to the bank suffer. But if you do let them suffer, the consequences of the default spread that arc of suffering to a very wide degree. Because when a bank collapses, all of its depositors, all of those whom the bank owes money to, lose their deposits. That means small businesses, it means cooperatives, it means large businesses, it means individuals who have their savings. It's right across the board. And bank deposits were guaranteed by the government last September because we believed that the only option in terms of Ireland was to give a very clear message to the outside world that Ireland wasn't going to follow the path of Iceland, that Ireland was not going to become an insolvent country, that Ireland's credit was such that we would stand behind those who had deposits in the banks, who had loaned to the banks, and ensure that the banks did not collapse. And we've succeeded in that. The guarantee has not been called upon. Yes, there are very interesting technical arguments about subordinated debt, at-risk debt. We didn't guarantee all of that. We guaranteed that subordinated debt which fell due within the guarantee period. None of Anglo-Irish's guaranteed debt fell due within the guaranteed period. We felt it was important for the larger banks that everyone dealing with them understood that these banks were creditworthy and that we stood behind them. And we also believed in the case of Anglo that the country couldn't stand the strain of an 80 billion default. And it can't. That's half our national wealth. Were we to go down that course, we would be in the same country as Iceland. We would have a collapsed economy as well as a collapsed banking system. So there's no point pretending that these are easy decisions. It's very easy to be populist about them and say the wrong track was taken then, if only we didn't do that. We had to do that. We have to protect the reputation of this country because the government is borrowing money to fund this country. The government wouldn't be able to borrow a cent if we permitted the banks to go into default. That's the reality of the fiscal position. Any high school economic analyst will tell you that. Anyone who deals in money worldwide will tell you that. So that's not an option that we have. So what we've had to do, having given the guarantee, is to reform the Irish banks, is to remove the personnel at board level and executive level and chairman level who caused these problems. That can't be done overnight, but the vast majority of them have now gone. In addition to that, the state has had to invest in the banking system and get a definite rate of return on it, as we have done. We've had to nationalise the Anglo-Irish Bank because it was such a mess. We've had to take 25% in Bank of Ireland and Allied Irish Bank. This is the famous 7 billion which George discussed earlier. What he didn't point out to you is that we are getting 7% return, or 8% return rather, on that 7 billion. What he didn't point out to you is that we've taken a 25% stake in each of those banks, and that stake has gone up in value since I purchased it. Last February it's gone up substantially in value, and that will go straight back into our national pension fund. What wasn't pointed out either was that we harvested a pension fund in the good times, and we've been able to spend a lot of that in investing in the banks and ensuring that, as well as socialising the losses, we socialise the gains in the banking system, and that we get something in return for the rescue which we're obliged to carry out. And I recall, and I'm sorry to introduce another political note, but when George's party was last substantially in government for a long period of time in 1984, the Allied Irish Bank was bailed out and not a penny came back to the taxpayer. That won't happen on my watch, I can tell you. And in every step I've taken in relation to the banking system, I've made sure that the taxpayer gets a definite return, and that, as well as socialising losses, we socialise gains, and that we get something back from these institutions for the efforts we have to do to protect them in the national interest. We don't have a choice about this, and it's not unique what we've done in Ireland. It's been done by the British government, it's been done by the authorities in the United States, and it's the recommended course of action of the G7 and of everyone in the world, because we can't have a repeat of 1929. We can't have a position where we decide that the whole motor of the economy should seize up, that we should simply close down banks and allow mass unemployment and a total cessation of economic activity take place. But of course what we have to do with the banks is ensure that they never behave like this again. What we have to do with the banks is ensure that the taxpayer and the public who've invested in them and rescued them are rewarded for their investment and their rescue. And what we have to do in the banks is replace the irresponsible bonus-driven culture of reckless lending with a culture which encourages lending to the people who create jobs in the economy, to the householders who want to make improvements in their houses and in their living standards, and to the green changes that have to take place throughout our economy. And in addition to that capital investment, we have to look at the exposures in the banks on the balance sheets, and we have to ensure that the banks can be repaired through the operation of asset management. The banks cannot lend unless they attract funds. That's the core problem. If you don't give a guarantee and reassure people that the funds are safe, you're not going to have any funds. And if you don't clean up the balance sheets and reassure the world that the banks are fit to lend to, you've continued uncertainty about the operation of these institutions. So we will issue paper to the banks under NAMA, and the European Central Bank are willing to honour that paper. They're willing to give the banks cash for that paper. And in return for that, the banks can focus on lending to small and medium-sized enterprises and households, while the NAMA works out the distressed loans over time. And the NAMA will buy the loans at a discount. It's not a bailout for the bank shareholders. In the case of one of the banks, we've nationalised it. We've made it clear in the case of the two larger banks that if their losses are of a scale which requires fresh capital, we will invest that capital and minimise the risk to the taxpayer and ensure that the taxpayer benefits from the upswing. And the borrowers, those to whom the banks extended money, will remain fully liable for the full value of their loans. This is not a bailout for borrowers or developers, as has been constantly misrepresented. The NAMA will have to pay its own way. The interest received on the performing loans, which are working out, will roughly match the interest paid on the bonds. The proceeds on the loan repayments and the property sales will pay off the bonds in full. If there's any further shortfall at the end of 10 years, we can levy the banks. I've gone in some detail through the banking situation, through the public finances, through competitiveness. There is hope for the future. One of the key points is that our exports have proven resilient, and they will drive growth and jobs as competitiveness improves. Again, I've set out a graph there on export performance in the European Union this year. And again, Ireland is in the green uniform. The other countries are in the European blue. And if you look at those figures, you'll see that our exports have seen a decline of 3%. But contrast that with the declines in the other countries. Our exports have remained remarkably robust in the present crisis. And that's a real sign of hope for us. Our pharmaceuticals, our chemicals, our ICT, a lot of these industries are still exporting and exporting vigorously. And there's a big demand for their products. Now, of course, agriculture is going through a very difficult patch, and tourism has seen a decline in numbers. But at the same time, it is a fact that when you measure all of the different sectors together, you see that 3% decline in export. It suggests that there's an underlying strength in the Irish economy. There's a labour force which is hard-working, which is prepared to take the pain. There's a labour force which also is one of the best educated in Europe. After Sweden, the highest proportion of third-level graduates in any labour force. There's an export performance which has held up very well in the current recession. And despite all the difficulties we saw earlier this year, it's continued to hold up, and hold up unlike many other countries. And as a result of all of that, you can see in the next page that our external position is moving into our balance. By external position, I mean our balance of payments. When you add up everything Ireland is doing, and when you end up and performing and exporting, and you add up everything that Ireland is taking from the rest of the world, you can see that from 2004 on, we began to have a big balance of payments deficit. We began, in other words, to go into the proposition that the world that owed us far more that we owed the world far more than the world owed us. And now you see this year, it's contracted to less than 1% of a deficit. And that is caused by the strength of our exports and also, of course, and I accept this, by the weakness of our consumer demand at present. But if you go then to what's going to happen next year, the forecast is that we'll have a balance of payments surplus. Now that isn't what happened in Iceland or Hungary or any of those other countries that got into difficulties in Europe. That surplus is there because there's an underlying strength in the Irish economy. We're exporting to other countries. And what we have to do to surmount this crisis is to deepen the adjustment, to ensure that that adjustment takes place, and takes place within a reasonable period of time. We can't postpone the adjustment indefinitely. But if we do the adjustment, if we have better public services, if we make them more efficient, if we make our competitiveness better, if we improve our competitiveness, if we take that necessary adjustment now, we will bequeath something very, very good for those who come after us. We did it before in 1987 and 1988 and 1989, after years of dithering. I grew to manhood in the late 70s and early 80s, and I remember how successive governments of my own party under Mr. Haughey and of Fine Gael under Dr. Fitzgerald, to our shame, dithered, refused to make the decisions, pandered to the vested interests, and then Ray McSherry and others came in 1987 and took the steps that put this country on a road to recovery. That's what we have to do now. That's what's needed now. Not dithering and posturing and postponement of the issues, but facing up to the issues and saying, yes, we have a great country. Yes, we have a great labour force. Yes, we faced crises throughout our national history. We were founded as an impoverished state in 1922 when the British cleared everything bar the typewriters out of the country. And we built a successful state. And I give all credit to the Cumann Gael element who founded the state to do that. And in the 1930s, we had to face a crisis under De Valera and McEntee and Lemass, where we had the Great Depression and we had an economic war and we had all those problems and we fought through them. And we had an intellectual and cultural and economic economic stagnation in the 1950s in this country, and Sean Lemass led us out of it. And we can bring ourselves out of this as well. This is not a case of us going back to the 80s or the 70s or the 50s or the 30s or the 20s, but it is a case of us facing up to the reality which Colin McCarthy has pointed out, which the World Bank have pointed out, which the European authorities have pointed out, which every economic commentator has pointed out, that we have gone that bit beyond what we can afford for ourselves. We make the necessary adjustments now. We're a small people, we know each other well, we have the capacity to do that. Unlike a lot of bigger countries, we can do it, we will do it. And the endorsement we've received, and I heard George talking about various economists in the IMF, they came here for a month back in May, and they interrogated me at length. And I regret to say their interrogation was far more difficult than any interrogation I've had in Dáil Éireann. And they said the policies are right. What is needed now for recovery is determined execution of NAMA and the government's budget plans. We will have that recovery. Let's make that bit of an extra effort now and do it, not just for our own sake, but for the sake of our kids who want to live in an Ireland that isn't Argentina defaulting on its debts, or Uruguay pretending it can have public services it can't afford, but a responsible country, the country that our forefathers fought for, a country that takes responsibility for itself in the best sense of that word, a Sinn Féin country, a country that believes not just ourselves alone, ourselves with others, working together, building up a community, building up all the public services we want, but recognising where we are in the world and what we can afford. Go to Míle Maith Agaibh.